Let's take a look at another Flaw descriptive weakening question. The question stem reads very standard. The reasoning is vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that the argument has done something, right? Because the argument confused something, took for granted something, failed to consider something. So once again, we have to apply the two-step test. Step one is to make sure that each of these charges is actually true, that if you say answer choice B, that the argument takes something for granted, that the argument in fact took something for granted, that if C is claiming the argument generalized from this thing to that thing, that in fact the argument did make that generalization. That's step one. Step two is that, oh, wait, is it a bad thing to generalize from, the fact that you did this, is that why the argument's vulnerable? The fact that you took this thing for granted, is that why the argument's vulnerable? That's step two. Okay, so maybe you want to try this question out yourself. I'll tell you that this is a very difficult question. 7-Sage Analytics evaluates this question as a 5-star question, and the statistics are really interesting. Of everyone who took this question as part of a prep test, the subset of people who got a 166 on the prep test, that's a really high score, by the way. I think it's like around a 95th percentile score. It's a really, really good score. Of that specific subset of people, 1 out of 4 missed this question. 25% of very high scoring test takers missed this question. So that gives you a sense of how hard this question is. But hopefully at the end of this lesson, you'll think that this is a very easy question. In fact, you'll think, I hope anyway, you'll see that this question is making what I like to call the oldest mistake in the book. A mistake that you've seen in other answer choices from other questions that we've done. A mistake that you will continue to see in future LR questions time and time and time again. In other words, I'm saying this is a cookie. It's cut from a specific cutter. The right answer choice is the shape of the cutter. So let's look at the argument. Right? Some anthropologists argue, so very classic opening, we are not told the author's position, but rather author is representing to us other people's position. Right? Other people's argument. They argue that human species could not have survived prehistoric times if the species had not evolved the ability to cope with diverse natural environments. However, but signaling the transition from context, other people's position over to our argument, there is considerable evidence that Australopithecus afarensis, a historic species related to early humans, also thrived in a diverse array of environments but became extinct. Hence, the anthropologist's claim is false. There's your premise. There's your conclusion. Now we're done with the labeling part of the argument. We now need to get into analysis. A couple of things you had to have picked up on: the conditionality of the language, the referential phrasing back to this conditional claim, the negation of this referential claim, which is a conditional claim, which means the negation of a conditional claim. Hopefully this is ringing bells from necessary assumption, right? As you see, everything builds, right? All of this stuff build on each other. The fact that this question relies on so many foundational building blocks, I think in large part explains why analytics has evaluated this question to be a 5-star difficulty question, okay? But I'm hoping that you'll be exposed so much to what I call foundational concepts that you do become very fluent with them, and that you will be able to see, hopefully at some point, that this is just incredibly repetitive. All right, so let's first map this out. What are these anthropologists saying? Right, they're saying that species had not evolved the ability to cope with diverse and natural environments, right? If they had not evolved the ability to cope, then, and again, notice I'm just suppressing a lot of details, right? I don't mean that those details are not important. Of course they're important, but to save space, I'm not writing them out, right? What does this mean? This means not evolve ability to cope with diverse natural environments. All of that is getting captured in this, okay? So what's the anthropologist saying? That if they had not evolved the ability to cope with natural environments, then they would not have survived prehistoric times. Now, do you recall what a contrapositive is? If not, review the lesson on contrapositives. If you do, then show me what the contrapositive is here. Okay, remember, you just flip the two things around, right? You flip the two things around and you slap negations on both. Right? So over here it would say survive, evolve the ability to cope. Which means another way to understand what the anthropologist is saying is that they're saying in order for the human species to have survived historic times, we must have evolved the ability to cope with diverse natural environments. Okay, that's what some anthropologists are saying. Now let's consider the author's argument. The author says there's considerable evidence that Australia, a prehistoric species related to early humans. So not exactly our ancestors, but like a cousin of our ancestors, right? So some, early human cousin species thrived in a diverse array of environments. Okay, so they did evolve the ability to cope with a diverse array of environments. That's what you're saying, right? Like they thrived. Not only did they cope, they thrived, right? That they thrived. So I'm to understand that the cousin species here met a necessary condition of survival. What the anthropologist is saying is a necessary condition of survival of a species. And this Australopithecus afarensis did meet that necessary condition. But look, they became extinct, meaning they did not survive, right? They did not survive. So therefore, hence, the anthropologist's claim is false, right? That your claim of survive implies evolve to cope is a false claim. This mistake in reasoning, now they don't call it a flaw, but right, vulnerable to criticism, but they could have. They don't have to, because earlier I mentioned in both the theory lesson and also in the previous lessons here, I mentioned that flawed reasoning is a subset of just generally speaking weak reasoning, right? It's a special kind of weak. You're flawed, right? You're just bland, uninteresting weak. Here you're flawed. You see, the fact that flawed reasoning is a subset of weakening reasoning means you can ask what's weak about this in order to not tie yourself to just general weakness or flaw weakness, right? But rather, if the questions I'm asked flaw, then you're kind of set to a flaw. It has to be a specific kind of weakness, flaw in other words, right? This is actually a flaw. So in other words, they could have changed the question stem up and just said, where is the flaw in the reasoning? It's a flaw because the premises here give no reason at all to believe the conclusion. Unlike other questions in descriptive weakening where the premises, like the one we saw with the cost-benefit analysis, it's not like the costs are irrelevant for the consideration. Of course they're relevant, right? They give some support to the conclusion, in other words. Here, this premise gives no support at all, right? If you don't recall the lesson on necessary assumption and how to properly negate conditional statements, I would advise you to return to that and just kind of, review that lesson. Because conditional reasoning is a foundational concept in logical reasoning. Okay, so let's say I want to argue that in order to go to law school, you must take the LSAT first. And imagine someone says, well, hold on a second. I know plenty of people who didn't go to law school and nonetheless took the LSAT. You see what I'm doing here? I'm analogizing the argument, right? I'm analogizing the argument here. Okay, some anthropologists say in order to go to law school, you got to take the LSAT. Our author says, well, hold on a second. Plenty of people not only took the LSAT, crushed it, right? Got a 180 on the LSAT, yet never went to law school. Therefore, it is false, your claim that in order to go to law school, you must take the LSAT. You see why this is just a big fat no, right? Like, no, you confused the original claim. To actually show that this is false, what do you actually need to do? Right? If you want to refute this claim, really want to refute this claim, you would have to say, well, hold on a second. I know people who went to law school and didn't take the LSAT, right? Whatever it may be. Maybe they took the GRE. Maybe they didn't take maybe they took something. It just doesn't matter. They just didn't take the LSAT. They went to law school anyway. Now I've refuted this claim. Now I say, oh, right, it's false that in order to go to law school, you have to take the LSAT because it's just plain as day. You can go to law school and not take the LSAT. Therefore, it's not true that in order to go to law school, you must take the LSAT. But it's important which element you're negating and which one you're affirming. This goes right back to our lesson on negation, how to properly negate conditionals. You have to say, look, the so-called sufficient condition can hold while the so-called necessary condition fails. And I've proven then this is not a sufficiency-necessity relationship, right? I've proven then it's not a sufficiency-necessity relationship. It is not, you're not doing anything when you do what the author here is doing by failing the sufficient condition and satisfying the necessary condition. You've proven nothing. Aside from just the face value of what this claim is, okay, apparently you can take the LSAT and not go to law school. That's fine. Nobody ever said taking the LSAT forced you into law school. Do you see what I mean? This is what I call the oldest mistake in the book. Sufficiency, necessity, confusion. And one of the reasons why I call it oldest mistake in the book is because it's just so common, but also because it's it forms the foundation of conditional logic. This distinction between a sufficient condition and a necessary condition, right? If this basic distinction is confused, then there's nothing we can build logic on, right? So if you're able to recognize this, not only are you getting this question right, you're going to be able to get it right fast because you're going to recognize how cookie cutter this question is. The argument is vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it confuses a conditions being required for a given result to occur in one case with a conditions being sufficient for a result to occur in a similar case. What's the condition being required, right? What's the required condition? The required condition is to evolve the ability to cope, right? That's the condition being required for a given result to occur. The given result is the result of survival, right? For survival to occur, the required condition is that you have to evolve to cope with diverse natural environments. In one case is the Homo sapiens case, humans case. They confuse this condition, right? With the condition here, the condition references the same condition. They confuse this condition as if it were sufficient, right? As if you thought, oh, it pointed this way for such a result, referencing this same result, right? The same result right over here, which is to say survival. They confused it for being sufficient, right? Meaning you thought the arrow pointed this way. To occur in a similar case, yeah, the similar case is of our cousins. Just like down over here, this argument confused a condition required for a result to obtain in one case, right? LSAT is required for law school admissions. But you thought LSAT was sufficient. You thought that taking the LSAT forced you into law school, which is why you argue the way you did. You're like, no, hold on a second. Taking LSAT doesn't force you into law school because you can take the LSAT and not go to law school. See, I've shown that it's false that taking the LSAT forces you into law school. Okay, yes, you have. You've shown that it's false that taking the LSAT forces you into law school. But the problem was that was not the original claim. The original claim was that to go to law school, you have to take the LSAT. Sufficiency, necessity, confusion, right? They added an additional complication, which is that they added an element of analogy to it, right? Which is why they say one case versus a similar case. In the simplified example I gave, there was no element of analogy, right? But that's a complication without consequence. Okay, so if all this line drawing was really confusing, and for good reason, I mean, it's confusing even to look at, right? Let's try that again. I want you to try that again. Just maybe draw the lines here, the referential phrasing lines here, internally before externally pinning down the abstract claims to the specifics of the argument, right? So internally, you have a condition being required for a given result, right? This is the condition which is required for a given result to occur with the condition, this condition references the same condition, being sufficient this time, right? Instead of being required now, they're saying this condition is sufficient for such a result references this very same result to occur in a similar case, right? One case versus similar case. That's the internal referencing. Now you need to do the external referencing. What's the condition that is set to be required for a given result? Well, here's the condition which is set to be required for a given result, right? Or contrapositively, here's the condition which is set to be required for a given result. And then this very same condition, right? This very same condition is being confused as a sufficient condition for that result. Okay, so I'm not expecting you to right now in this moment be like, oh yeah, that was super easy, right? In fact, I'm kind of expecting you to still think that this is a very confusing question, a very hard question. That's fine, right? It's because, well, I don't know how much studying you've done, but if the extent of your LSAT, LR studying is the extent of this logical reasoning primer, then, you know, it's not going to be very clear at all. You're going to have to practice a lot more, do a lot more flaw descriptive weakening questions, must be true questions, necessary assumption questions. Just play around with logic a lot more before it becomes clear why this describes the error and you know, before you can just really see it and understand it and feel it. Okay, now let's consider the other answer choices. And before we do, I just want to make a general point about all of them, which is that they're all going to be really attractive if you're not already attracted to answer choice A. They're each asking you to consider this thing over here, or this thing over here, or this thing, or this thing, trying to draw your attention away from what the reasoning error is in the actual argument presented. Okay, so I think the best way to see why they're not right is for us to consider each answer choice and then ask ourselves, what would the argument in the stimulus have had to look like in order for, say, B to be descriptively accurate of it? And then contrast that, what would the argument have had to look like, version of the argument, against the actual version of the argument. And notice that those are not the same argument. So in that way, B describes this potential argument that could have existed, as opposed to describing the actual argument that does exist, right? And same with C, D, and E. It's a very helpful exercise when you're studying for the test or you're blind reviewing a question, right? So start practicing getting into a habit of doing that now. B says, the argument takes for granted that if one species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive certain conditions, at least one related extinct species must have had the same characteristic. Okay? So first, you have to establish what the characteristic is that, here's the modification, happened to enable it to survive certain conditions, right? What are you talking about? Like, what's the thing that happened to enable it to survive? The only two candidates I see here is survival and the evolution of mechanisms to cope with diverse whatever, right? Well, the characteristic must be this that you're talking about, but it's strange to call this thing a characteristic that happened to enable survival because, in the stimulus, it's not a characteristic that happened to enable, rather, this is a necessary condition of survival. It's not just it's to survive. This thing happened to allow you to survive. We didn't say it like that. We said survival necessitates this. So already B seems to fail the descriptive accuracy test, right? But let's come up with an argument where, let's say one species, Homo sapiens, had a characteristic being social, right? Which, let's say, being social wasn't necessary, but it did happen to enable survival, right? Okay, so Homo sapiens, being social, happened to enable our survival. Then A. afarensis, at least one related extinct species, we conclude must also have had been social. That would have been the argument, right? I'll say that again. Homo sapiens have this pro-social characteristic which happened to help us survive. Well, then our extinct cousin ancestor species must also have been pro-social. That argument, at minimum, meets descriptive accuracy for B. Hopefully you can see that argument looks nothing like this argument. Okay, that's why B is not right. Descriptively inaccurate. C is the same. C says it generalizes from the fact that one species with a certain characteristic survives certain conditions that all related species with the same characteristic must have survived exactly the same conditions. Now, I did B, I don't know if I did it fast or slow for you. If I did it fast, if you felt like it was fast, it's only because I've done literally thousands of these questions. So I've seen something like this maybe dozens of times, right? And same with C. I've seen arguments that fit this mold, I've seen cookies that fit this shape dozens of times, right? What C is saying is that, you know what this argument is? We establish a fact that Homo sapiens had, pro-social tendencies, and that allowed Homo sapiens to survive certain conditions. That's true, that's a fact. Okay, so from this fact, we generalize up from that fact that not only was this true of Homo sapiens, all of our related species, A. afarensis and all the other names that I don't know, the ones that also had pro-social tendencies must also have survived the exact same conditions. That's our conclusion, right? I'll say that again, the argument goes like this. Homo sapiens with pro-social tendencies survive certain conditions. That's the premise. Therefore, I conclude all of our related cousin species with pro-social tendencies also survive the same conditions. That's my conclusion. Does that argument look anything like this? No, right? I mean, aside from the fact that, we're talking about Homo sapiens and, Australia, whatever. But come on, right? It's not even, first of all, both of the arguments I gave for B and C didn't involve some other people's claim and an attempt to disprove some other people's claim, right? So neither B nor C is descriptively accurate. D, I think, is really, really attractive. D says the argument fails to consider the possibility that afarensis had one or more characteristics that lessen its chances of surviving prehistoric times. I think it's true. I think, the argument did in fact fail to consider the possibility that, we know they didn't survive. We know they evolved to be able to cope with diverse natural environments. Truly, the argument does not consider what other characteristics lessen its chances of survival. Okay, fine, descriptively accurate. But is that why this argument doesn't flow? The answer is no. Now, I think what D is trying to do is D is trying to bait you away from the task at hand, which is argument evaluation. It's trying to bait you away from that over to hey, let's play anthropologist here, right? Let's let's ask ourselves, how come afarensis didn't survive yet evolved the ability to cope with diverse natural environments? I mean, look, Homo sapiens evolved the ability to cope, and they did survive. We did survive. So isn't it interesting that afarensis, in spite of the fact that they evolved the ability to cope with natural environments, didn't survive? Why is that? Maybe it is because they had some failing, right? Some weakness in their, maybe they were, whatever, you can just make stuff up, right? But do you see how far off the track you've already, like, the path is here. You've wandered deep into the woods. We're on the trail of argument analysis. D led you on a false trail of let's play anthropologist and try to explain this phenomenon. In the explanation of this phenomenon, yeah, you might want to consider the possibility that there's some failing that afarensis had that Homo sapiens didn't have. And if you didn't consider that, that's, well, you should have, right? That's bad on you. But that's not the task. Our task, once again, is argument analysis. So this is probably like the 20th time I've used the phrase argument analysis in this question and the previous question we did. And again, I really want that phrase to sink in. What does it mean to do argument analysis to be distinct in your mind from other adjacent similar tasks, right? We saw one example of that in the previous question with answer choice E. Here, we're seeing D trying to do exactly the same thing. Forget the argument. Who cares about the argument? It's so boring. Let's just take this phenomenon. Let's try to explain it. Okay, you have to resist that urge. All right, and lastly, E says, fails to consider the possibility that even if a condition caused the result to occur in one case, it was not necessary to cause the result to occur in a similar case. Now, what this means is that let's take a causal condition, right? Some cause of some result. We're saying that, look, just because you establish that, say, evolving the ability to cope to a natural diverse environment is the cause of survival in one case, in some similar case, that cause wasn't necessary, meaning just because Homo sapiens evolved the ability to cope and that caused them to survive doesn't mean that afarensis had to evolve the ability to cope in order to survive. They could have, it's not necessary. They could have not evolved the ability to cope, yet survived anyway. In other words, E is saying just because something is a cause in one situation doesn't mean that it's the only cause, right? You have to consider that there may be other causes that can affect the same result in other situations. Okay, so many ways in which E doesn't map onto the argument. First of all, this is not a causal relationship that was laid out. This was a sufficiency-necessity relationship. And the second error is that this argument is not about taking a cause and assuming that cause to be the only cause, the necessary cause. Right? I mean, that's what E thinks it is. E is like, oh, you fail to consider that maybe it's not a necessary cause. Maybe there are other causes. That's not the mistake here.